No questions. Well, that's a good thing. All right. Okay, so I wanted to cover a couple things that I've been talking to some agents with recently, especially with some of the changes with commissions. We're starting to see a lot more unrepresented buyers and going down that direction. So I want to talk a little bit about unrepresented buyers and the first for sale by owner agreement. I'm going to share my screen so you can see it. Okay. Hopefully you can see that. Russ, can you see that? Okay, perfect. Okay, so here's the unrepresented buyer disclosure. This first part is what I wanted to bring up first. This disclosure form is not a contract. Signing it does not create a relationship between you and the real estate agent who has also signed it. Okay, so this is important to know because one of the reasons why buyer's agents don't want to work with agents is they don't want to sign a contract binding them to them. So when you send this over for them to sign, there might be some hesitation. Now, usually it's hesitation because people don't read contracts. And since it's the very first thing, it's highlighted in red just because I wanted to highlight it for you, but in the normal contract, it's not highlighted. So it's just this first part. It's not a contract. It's just a disclosure, which if you look at the very top, it's just a disclosure. It's helping them understand who is represented. And that goes back to a law that's here in Utah that says that as a professional, that you have to disclose who we represent whenever we're in a transaction or working with somebody. We have to disclose who we represent on that. So what this is doing is it's starting out with just disclosing what the different agents' responsibilities are. It's just going to say this is what a seller's agent is. This is what a buyer's agent is. And it's pretty simple. A real estate agent who lists a seller's property for sale acts as the agent for the seller only. I think this is a key part here, seller only, and has fiduciary duties of loyalty, full disclosure, confidentiality, reasonable care to the seller. In practical terms, so then we're going to dumb it down just a little bit. The seller hires a seller's agent to locate a buyer and negotiate transactions with terms favorable to the seller. Although the seller's agent has these fiduciary duties to the seller's agent is by law responsible to all prospective buyers to treat them with honesty, fair dealings, and with good faith. So one of the things we have to keep in mind is, yes, we do represent the seller in this situation. A buyer's coming in, they don't have representation. You cannot just take advantage of a buyer just because they don't have representation, but you are looking out for your client, the seller, their best interest. So one of the questions I get a lot is, if it's an unrepresented buyer, how do I get all the forms signed by them? How do I get the contract? What if it's not correct? What do I do? In that scenario, because you are helping the seller, you can help the buyer to get things filled out and sent to the seller. What you're not doing is you're not advising them in any way. So if they asked you the question, well, what price should I put on there? You wouldn't be answering that question directly to them because you're representing the seller. So you can fill that out for them. You can help them get the contract signed in the right places, but you're not actually giving them advice through this process. It does describe what a buyer's agent is. So if they are unfamiliar with that, they can choose to have a buyer or even limited agency. This confirmation of agency at the very bottom, this one's kind of important. So I want to read this one. The property shown above is presently listed for sale through the company. Consequently, the company and the agents are representing the seller. By signing this unrepresented buyer disclosure, the buyer acknowledges and agrees that the agent and the company will only represent the seller in this transaction as a seller's agent. The buyer acknowledges that the company and the agents have advised the buyer that the buyer is entitled to be represented by a buyer's agent who will represent only the buyer. The buyer has, however, elected to not be represented by a real estate agent in this transaction. Okay, so this is important that they're acknowledging they don't want to be represented. So the question I would have for you guys is, when should this be filled out? Somebody unmute and tell me when it should be filled out.
When
and
you
signed.
first meet with them.
Okay, when you first meet with them. We had a scenario last week where our agent represented the seller. An unrepresented buyer came in, they wrote the contract, got it under contract, then realized they didn't do the undisclosed disclosure and sent it over to the buyer, and the buyer refused to sign it. Okay, this document is designed to help protect us, because the court system is not going to look highly on a professional going against an unprofessional in this process. So if you don't disclose to them that, hey, you know for sure that I'm an agent, like if they can't, this buyer came back and said, well, I didn't know I could get representation. This seller's agent took advantage of me. It would be a really hard case for us to defend that, because it's basically their word against ours, and they're the public and we're the professional. So we should have been doing this in the first place. So this needs to be signed. So here's a scenario that I want you to think about is, let's say the buyer doesn't want to sign this. Well, you haven't submitted the offer to your client yet, and you haven't done anything for them. I would wait until they sign it. Just say, either bring a real estate agent with you, or you'll need to sign this document before we submit an offer. That way you guarantee you get this signed. Now remember, it's not a contract, so there shouldn't, if you're explaining this to them and they truly want to go unrepresented, there should be no reason they don't sign this contract. And it's going to protect you as an agent and us as a company by getting this signed every time. So it needs to be signed before you even submit an offer to your client. I would get it signed before you do really anything on behalf of, well, on behalf of your seller for the benefit of that buyer. So whatever you're doing for them, even showing the home would be a good thing to get this signed, so that you're disclosing who you are in the process. Any questions on the buyer?
Yeah, I have a question. So to piggyback on what you just said, I get a phone call, hey, I'd like to see your listing. I ask the appropriate questions. Hey, are you being represented? Who's your agent? No, we want to be unrepresented. Fantastic. Before I show you the property, I'd like to review a disclosure. May I send it over? Would that be covering your ass, or do you need to get, I get a little confused
So
with
the law
this.
itself says you have to disclose it. Okay, so
Okay.
just said, I represent the seller. I want to make sure you're aware. And the one that this comes up the most is when you're doing an open house. Technically, when somebody comes walking into the home, you need to disclose to them that you represent the seller in the transaction, so it's disclosed. This is one more layer of protection. So do you need to go, like you call them up and you're going to show the home, do you need them to sign it before you do that? Not necessarily, as long as you're disclosing it, but it's not necessarily a bad idea not to. Now, however, I would say before you write any contracts for that buyer to your client, I would have this signed, and that will protect you through that whole process.
So I'm not on an open house. They just call off the sign. You know, they don't have an agent. They just like to see the property. Would I need them to sign this, or a buyer broker for just that property, or do I just show the property? That's where I get confused.
Yeah, no, that's a good question, because with the new law of making sure you have a buyer broker sign before you show any property, the difference is that you do represent the seller. Okay, so in this case, you, on behalf of the seller, you're showing the home. The buyer doesn't need to have a buyer broker agreement, and they don't really need to have this signed for you to just go show them the property. But as soon as you move from showing the property to writing an offer and helping them get in contact with your seller, doing more than just showing the property, I would get this disclosure signed so that they are confirming that they know you told them.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, the next one is, let's say that you represent a buyer and you're going for sale by owner contract, okay? We've seen a little bit of confusion with this lately, especially because now the commission is written into the REPC. So in order for you to get paid, you either need to do a for sale by owner commission agreement, or you need to put the commission into the REPC. And the challenge is either way you can get paid. So they're agreeing in either case that you would get paid. The problem comes in when you decide not to do the for sale owner commission agreement and you just do the REPC, you eliminate everything else that's in this disclosure that's protecting you. So if the seller doesn't have an agent, my recommendation is do this for sale by owner commission agreement. Okay, there's a couple things in here that I wanted to highlight. The brokerage fee is going to be right there in number 2. You're going to do your name and the buyers and the property, then the brokerage fee. Protection period. This is one that is different than some of the other contracts we have. This last part says the seller agrees to exempt the buyer upon entering into a valid listing agreement with another brokerage. So let's say that I have them sign this, I show the property, it doesn't necessarily work for my buyer. So then the seller decides, okay, well, actually, I really want an agent to help me. So I'm going to list the property. And then my buyer decides, oh, actually, you know what? Now that it's listed, I think I really do want to buy that property. But this will keep protecting us, and they'll exempt the buyer from the other sales. Number 4, seller warrants, disclosures. The seller agrees to personally complete and sign the property condition disclosures. So we represent the buyer. The seller doesn't have the property condition disclosure. It's saying right here that the seller will fully inform us as agents about this condition, and then we can give them the property disclosure to fill out and give back to us to give to our buyer. So sometimes there's confusion with, okay, I don't represent you, so I can't do anything for you. That's on the buying side and the selling side. When in reality, it's not about not being able to do things for them. It's about not advising them and not giving them information that they shouldn't be getting from you, is basically what it is. Number 5, agency relationship. This is where it just discloses that we represent the buyer. Here in the middle, it says the seller has, however, elected not to be represented by a real estate agent in this transaction. The seller further acknowledges and agrees that all actions of the company and agents, even those that assist the seller in performing and completing any of the seller's contractual or legal obligations, are intended for the benefit of the buyers exclusively. So this is where it gives you permission to assist the seller in performing or completing any of the seller's contractual or legal obligations. So one question I got a couple of weeks ago was, the seller doesn't have a title company. They don't know what to do. Can I help them with it, or what needs to happen? That's part of their contractual obligations. As the buyer's agent, I can give them suggestions. Here's the title company we're using. You've got to get a title policy for the buyer. You've got to get it done before the seller's disclosures. You can help them get this process done, but just keep that in mind, that that's where it's saying it. So an agent who says, I'm just going to put it in the REPC, I'm only going to do the commission in the REPC, the for sale by owner is going to have to pay me anyway. These are all disclosures you're not getting when you just do it through the REPC, and that could create problems for you, because if the for sale by owner comes back and says, well, I didn't realize you were representing a buyer and you didn't tell me to do all these things and all of that stuff, that's why we want to have this for sale by owner agreement signed. Professional advice, that's the same as all the other ones, just basically saying we recommend you obtain the information independently. Dispute resolution, this is different than our contract. The first thing is going to be submitted to mediation through a mediation provider mutually agreed upon by parties. So as a company, we'd rather try to work it out with the sellers prior to any problems, but so that's our first line of defense right there is we're going to go to mediation. Everything else on here is the same. This one is a question I've had before. The seller authorizes. So under our obligation with the MLS and our membership with the board, we agree that we are going to give them the information of all of the sales of our properties. Well, if they're selling their home on their own, we need permission from them to be able to put that on the MLS because that's what our obligation is. This puts it on the seller that they will actually allow us to do that. So we've seen that problem come up where a seller says, I don't want it to be on the MLS, and it creates a problem for us as agents because we've agreed that we will put it on the MLS. Let's see. And then the last part right here, 13, entire agreement. The commission agreement includes the seller property disclosures forms, contains the entire agreement between the parties. So there's two things that constitutes this agreement. One is this commission report, and the second one is actual property, seller's property condition disclosure, which means us as agents, we can provide that to the for sale by owner to fill out. Now, we've talked about this a lot, and I just going to reiterate, we don't fill that out for the sellers ever, regardless, even if we represent them. But in this case, this is included into this contract that we will give that to them. They'll provide it for us. And that's the entire agreement. They'll sign, we'll sign, and then we'll be protected in that. If at any time there's an addendum to this contract, there's a specific for sale by owner commission agreement and agency disclosure addendum. It's basically just like any of the other addendums we have, but it's designed for that document specifically, and you can change whatever you need right here. Any questions on the for sale by owner agreement? Okay, perfect. Okay, so don't be worried about working with an unrepresented client. In fact, sometimes I think it's a little less, if you get these things signed, it's a little less liability than trying to do a limited agency. When you're working with the office and you do a limited agency, it means you represent the buyer and you represent the seller. You're really doing two transactions. You need two different disclosures. You need all of the paperwork for the office. If you're doing an unrepresented buyer form, the office is requiring unrepresented buyer form signed or the for sale by owner agreement signed. And you're not going to need to do through all the other disclosures because we don't actually represent them in that process. So a little less paperwork. I think the only disadvantage of it is if you're going for number of transactions, the MLS will only count it as one. Unless you do a limited agency, then they count it as two. So if you're going for the amount on the MLS, then a limited agency is there. If not, I would suggest trying to go unrepresented so you can stick with just your client. You can still get paid if you look at our new exclusive right to sell. If an unrepresented buyer is there, there's a number you can put in there. You can still get paid. And I would suggest that you don't just put 0 there. You are taking on extra work, extra liability. You're making sure things get done. You're not having to deal with another agent. I'd still put some money there, but everyone can do whatever is best for them. Okay. That is all I have with that. If anyone has any questions about that, or I'll even open it up to any other questions you might have today. Or was I on mute the whole time?
Thank you, Jason. I just had that experience with the for sale by owner that I needed to use that agreement with. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Yep. Did you have any issues with getting that signed?
No, they just didn't accept our offer. So, but I've used it before and never had a problem with it.
Okay, perfect. Okay. All right. If not, have yourself a great weekend, and you can always reach out to Russ or I if you have any questions. We're here to help.
Thanks,
Thanks so
Jason.
much. Thank you.